Hi, I'm Chris, and in this tutorial we're going to be making a 2.5D point-and-click adventure game using Adventure Creator and Unity. This is going to be a remake of an earlier tutorial, so that we're using more recent versions. I'm going to be using Unity 2018.3 and Adventure Creator version 1.66.4. 2.5D refers to the use of 3D characters on top of 2D backgrounds, and so we're going to be making a simple scene that we can navigate around, relying on photographs for our backgrounds. I have open here a fresh project with Unity 2018.3, and I've got my asset store window open here where I can import the latest release of Adventure Creator. We'll then be given this installation window, just asking us if we're happy for it to create a couple of inputs and layers. That's all fine, so I'll check OK. And once it's finished importing, we'll have this new Adventure Creator folder in our project window. This tutorial is also going to make use of a few other assets, and we can find these on the Adventure Creator downloads page. If I go up to the top toolbar and choose Adventure Creator Online Resources, and then Downloads, we'll be taken to this page on the website, and if I scroll down to Tutorial Assets, Evil Layer and Wharf, I can click to download a .unity package. If I then navigate to where it's been saved and double click on it, Unity will then ask me which files I want to import. I'm going to import all of them. And once it's finished, we'll then get this other folder, Tutorial Files, also in our Assets directory. If we open it up, we'll find two subfolders within it. I'm going to go to Wharf and then open up the Wharf scene that is inside, just to show you we have, to begin with, this grid floor here that is going to act as the area that the player can move, as well as a few reference cameras that we'll be making use of later on. But for now, I'm going to start with a new scene and make use of the new game wizard to set up our project. Each game that is made using AC relies on its own set of managers, and each manager controls a different aspect of your game's development. We can create a new set of managers by going to the top toolbar and choosing Getting Started, New Game Wizard. And it's then just a case of filling in the fields as we go. So I'll choose Next, and we'll be asked to enter in a game name. I'll type in my 2.5D game. Choose Next. Perspective is going to be 2.5D. And we're going to be having multiple backgrounds in a single scene, so I'll leave this checkbox unchecked. Our interface, or how do we want to interact with hotspots, I'm going to leave it as context sensitive because that's not the focus of this tutorial, and this option is the most simple. For other modes, check out the 3D tutorial. Choosing Next again, our GUI system, I'll leave it as default AC, and what this will do is just provide us with a default set of menus that we can use to open up the pause menu, save and load our game, access inventory, and so on. Choosing Next one more time, we'll just be asked to confirm our choices. Our movement method is set to point and click, which is what we want. So I'll choose Finish. And our managers will then be created. We'll then be asked if we want to organize the scene. I'm going to choose No because we're going to work with an existing scene. We're then also given the AC Game Editor window, and I'm going to pop this in a vertical space here because it tends to be quite deep. If we go to, say, the Settings Manager, you can see it's very vertical. Let's now go back to the Wharf scene. I'll choose Don't Save, and with the Scene Manager open, we have this basic structure panel, and we get two options to organize our scene objects, and I'm going to choose with folders. There is no wrong answer here, it's really just a case of preference. But this option just gives us a selection of folder game objects that we can use to keep our hierarchy uncluttered. I'll place the directional light in the lights folder, the wharf, which is the floor, into my set geometry folder, and my main camera into my cameras folder. I'll then just save the scene as a new scene. I'll go to File, Save As, and inside my 2.5D game, I'll call this my wharf. .5D games typically work by having either pre-rendered or photographic backgrounds underlaid underneath 3D characters where the perspective matches so that you don't really see that part of the scene is in 2D and part of it is in 3D. We're going to be using photographic backgrounds, and we can find some texture files in Tutorial Files, Wharf, Set, and then Photos. And we have 4 texture files here: Waterfront, Steps, Plaza, and Office. And the area that these photos were taken in has been recreated in this, this model here. This is the floor of the area that the photos show, and it's the area that the character in our scene will be able to walk around in. The waterfront in this picture is this rectangle down here. The steps is this ramp, and we have the plaza and office around the top here. We also have these 4 cameras in our scene. If I expand the reference cameras folder, we've got cameras already set up in the corresponding positions that each of these photos were taken. But we're going to be just using those for reference. I'm going to be making new cameras from scratch, and I can do that from the AC Game Editor in the Scene Manager. And if I scroll down, I get this Scene Prefabs section, and I want to make a new Game Camera 2.5D, so I'll click on it and rename it to Waterfront Cam. If I then look at its inspector, you can see its component just has a single background field, and I'll click on Create because it's empty at the moment, and it'll automatically create and assign this Waterfront Cam background object. I'll drag that into my set geometry folder, and looking at the inspector for this, you can see we've got, again, just a single field, this time a background texture, and I'm going to assign the waterfront texture. Now that that's assigned, I can go back to Waterfront Cam, and you can see we now have a Set as Active button, and if I click on it, well, we'll actually have to see the effects of the game window. So I'm going to have the game window and the scene window open at the same time. So now that this is active, I can move this camera around the scene, and it'll show both the floor and the background texture underneath it. So what I'm going to do is position it at the same place as this waterfront reference camera. Go to the transform component of that reference camera and choose copy component, and I'll paste that back into the transform of this waterfront cam. I'll also make sure that the field of view matches up. On the reference camera it's 35, so I'll enter in 35 to my new game camera. And you can see now that the floor matches up with the background. I'll remove the waterfront reference camera just so I don't get them mixed up. And because this is going to be the first camera in our scene, I'm going to make it the default. So I'll go back to the Scene Manager, and underneath our scene settings we have a field for a default player start, which is necessary for where the player will begin. I'll click on Create, and I'll also choose from the list that now appears, we've got our default camera, and I'll choose Waterfront Cam. Our default player start is, if I double click on it, already in the correct place in our scene. Maybe I'll just move it a little bit forward, and you can see it's represented by this blue arrow here in the game window. I'm going to now create the other 3 cameras that we'll need in our scene. So I'll click again, Game Camera 2.5D. This one I'll call Steps Cam. I'll just duplicate these now. Plaza Cam and Office Cam. And going to each of their inspectors, I'll create a new background image. I'll place these in the set geometry folder, and selecting each in turn, I'll assign the relevant texture into their background texture field. So Plaza Cam will get Plaza, Steps Cam will get Steps, and let's go sort out Steps Cam. So this is going to be at the position that this camera is in. So selecting inside reference cameras, steps, I'm going to copy the transform component, select my steps cam, and paste in those values. I'll also make a note that the field of view is going to be 33. And then let's test that out by choosing set as active. And you can see we have our the ramp matches up with the steps. So I'll remove the steps reference camera. Next, we'll do Plaza Cam. So Plaza, I'll choose copy component. Our field of view is going to be 23. Selecting Plaza Cam, I'll paste the component values and give it a field of view of 23. Setting as active, you see our floor matches up with the camera better. I'll remove the Plaza Cam. And finally, Office Cam, I'll copy the component from Office, paste it into Office Cam, and give it a field of view of 35. Setting as active, you can see the floor once again matches up. So I can now just remove my reference cameras folder. And that's it. We now have a set of 4 cameras with the default player start and camera. So I can run the scene. Although we can't really do anything, we do have the floor showing, although we'll get rid of this later, along with the background showing underneath. An important consideration to make early on when making a 2.5D game is that of the aspect ratio. You can see down here in the game window we have an aspect ratio set of 16:9, but because it's possible for the player to change what resolution their game plays at, we need to ensure that the game runs properly at all resolutions. Now the backgrounds are 1920 pixels by 1080, which gives us an aspect ratio of 16:9, which matches up what we currently have the game window set to. But if we run the game, you'll see that the background actually gets squashed and we get these 2 vertical bars either side. And the reason for that is AC is setting its own aspect ratio, it's just that it's not configured to match the backgrounds yet. Going to our AC game editor and then the settings manager, we can scroll down to camera settings, and here we have force aspect ratio checked by default for 2.5D games, and then our aspect ratio as a decimal is entered in as 1.5. So an aspect ratio of 16:9 in decimal form is 1.778, so that's what I'll type into the field here. And if we now play the game, you'll see that those borders are now removed, but if we changed the aspect ratio here in the game window, we have these black borders appearing to ensure that the game appears correct no matter what the ratio actually is. Now I admit I did actually get a bit confused by the fact that if you open up tutorial files, Wharf, Set, Photos, and then select any of the photos, the resolution actually comes up wrong in Unity. It comes up as 2048 by 1024, and I think what Unity is doing is rounding it to the nearest power of 2. So Don't be confused by that. And actually, in the videos that follow, I'm actually using the incorrect aspect ratio of 2:1. So just leave it as 16:9 or 1.778 as a decimal. We're now ready to start configuring the navigation of our scene. This is going to be a point and click game, and that is set again in the settings manager. Underneath interface settings, you can see we have our movement method set to point and click. And if it was set to something else, we can set it there from this field. Just above it, we have this player field, which is currently empty. And if we assigned a player prefab here, then that player would be spawned in at runtime. We'll be making a player of our own later on, but for now, I'm just going to use the demo games player just so that we can get up and running quickly. We can find the demo games player inside Adventure Creator, Demo, and then Resources, and I'll just drop Tin Pot directly into the scene. If we run the scene, he's placed correctly at the player start, but clicking around the scene on the floor doesn't really do anything. And that's because we need to set up the nav mesh. We can choose our pathfinding method by going to the Scene Manager, and up at the top, underneath Scene Settings, we have Pathfinding Method. I'll set this to Unity Navigation so that we can rely on Unity's own navigation tools. We can open up the navigation window by going to Window, AI, and then Navigation. And if I click on Bake, we'll then get the option to bake our nav mesh. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this floor wharf object, go to its inspector, and make sure that navigation static is checked. I can then go to the navigation window, click on Bake, and we now get this blue nav mesh baked for us. I think I'll increase the agent radius to about 0.35, rebake it, and that'll just help to prevent the player falling off the edge if he's maybe moving a bit too quickly. The final step is just to place this wharf floor object on the nav mesh layer, and that's just so that it can be picked up with mouse cursor clicks, so that when we click on the floor, the player is able to move there. So running the game again, I can now point and click, I can double click to make the player run. Now we want to be able to test out the other cameras, and later on we'll be making triggers to do that, but right now we don't have any, so I want to be able to test out the different cameras manually, and I can do that by going up to the Cameras folder and then Game Cameras. Let's try out the Steps cam. If I go to the Game Camera 2.5D component, I can choose Make Active from the side menu, and that will automatically cut the camera to the Steps cam. This is a new feature in AC version 1.66.5, so I can move up the steps. Let's try out Plaza Cam by choosing Make Active. And finally, Office Cam. Now we have this pillar in front of these doors here, and we want the player to have to move around it, because right now he can just move straight through it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut out that part of the nav mesh. I'll start by going to the Office Cam and choosing Set as Active outside of Play Mode so that we can work on it. I'll go over to roughly where this pillar is going to be. It's going to be about here. And in the hierarchy window, I'll choose Create 3D Object Cube. I'll put it down into the floor. Try to position it just by eyeballing, stretch it out. That's roughly about right. And then what I'll do is again, I'll go to the top of the inspector, check on navigation static, and rebake the nav mesh. With that baked, I'll just place it into my set geometry folder, uncheck the mesh renderer component so that we don't actually see it, and that'll stop the player walking through the pillar. Now that we have our navigation set up, let's work on automating the switching of cameras as the player moves around the scene. We can do that using triggers, and we can find triggers in the Scene Manager, going down to the Scene Prefabs section, and underneath Logic we have Trigger. And a trigger is essentially a boundary that will run certain game logic when the player or any object enters or leaves it. And what we're going to do is make this trigger cut the camera when the player enters this region where the stairs are. So I'll move it over, raise it up a little bit, and stretch it out so that it covers the whole portion, like so. Then go into its inspector. I'll rename the trigger Enter Steps. And underneath its list of trigger properties, I'm going to set its When Running field to Run in Background so that it doesn't create a cutscene. And everything else is as it should be. The trigger is going to detect the player, and it'll only react during gameplay. So underneath is where we place our actions that are basically commands that will run when the trigger is run. And I'm going to change the default one to a camera switch action, and we get fields for a new camera, and I'm going to set this new camera to be Steps Cam. We can test this out by running the game, and I want to be able to enter in the steps by clicking at the bottom here, but you can see the trigger doesn't quite reach it. Now I can just move the trigger in, move the trigger so it is over the player, and the camera cuts as normal. But we want to be able to have the player then enter this space here and cut the camera back to the waterfront. So I'm going to leave the trigger around here. In fact, what I'll do is I'll just tweak it a little bit now that I've got the player in the correct spot, and copy its component values, exit play mode, and then paste those values back in. So we're going to need a way of making the player move towards this trigger when we click at the bottom of the screen with the waterfront camera active. If we go to the waterfront cam and choose Set as Active so that we can see it while editing, I'm going to do this by creating a hotspot. Back in our game editor, I'm going to click on Hotspot, and I'll rename this Waterfront to Steps. And a hotspot is an area of the screen that will run commands or actions when we click on it. And I can get a better idea of where this is going to be by checking gizmos in the game window. And then if I stretch it out, move it back maybe a bit, you can see that it's then taking up this yellow region of space at the bottom of the game window. So we want to make it so that when the player clicks on this, he walks over to, say, maybe around this area here, so that he's in view of the steps cam. And because he's then in the region of the trigger, the camera will then cut as well. Selecting the hotspot and going to its inspector, we were able to create a number of interaction types that will run actions when we click on it. I don't actually want to run any actions. All I want to do is have the player walk towards it. So I'm going to create a new use interaction, but I'm going to leave the interaction field, which actually dictates what actions are run, blank. But I will be setting the player action to walk to marker. This warning message then appears saying we need a walk to marker defined, and we can see our walk to marker field further up is currently set to nothing, so we get this handy create button. I'll click on this and we now get marker waterfront to steps, and it's symbolized by this little green arrow here. So I'll move this arrow, say, just to the bottom of this ramp, And if I open up the steps cam and choose set as active, you can see that it's now appearing in the view here. So I'll move it maybe a little to the left, like so. And if I select the enter steps trigger, you can see that the player is now going to walk into this trigger. Let's now run the scene. I'll uncheck gizmos again, and if I hover over the mouse, you'll get this waterfront to steps label appear, and if I click on it, the player then walks over. We'll want to make a few tweaks to this, which we'll be covering next. So we now have a portion of the screen that is defined by a hotspot, and you can see the label waterfront to steps coming up. And we're going to make this a little bit more user-friendly. The waterfront to steps name is really an internal name that we use when building the scene. And I could just rename the game object, but I can also enter in a label if not name field. So I'll just type in steps. Now I'll leave this as lowercase because I'm going to have a verb appear dynamically in front of this. If I play the game again, you can see the label now changes to steps, but I want to have exit to steps appear instead. I can make a verb appear by going up to our cursor manager, and underneath interaction icons, we have a list of 3 default verbs that we can make use of. We have use, talk to, and look at. And a little bit further up, underneath hotspot cursor, we have this checkbox prefix cursor labels. And if I check that, we'll then get use steps appear. And it's set to use because that is what is set in our hotspot inspector. The use interaction that we made has a cursor or icon field set to use. And what we're going to do is create a new type of icon. So coming out of play mode, I'll go back to the cursor manager, and you can see prefix cursor labels is still checked because any of the fields we change in the managers survive play mode. So I'm going to go down to interaction icons, click on create new icon, and I'll enter in the label as exit to. We're not going to be changing the cursor's graphic, so I'll just leave the texture as empty. But going back to the hotspot inspector, I can now change the cursor icon field to exit to. And now when we hover over the hotspot, it correctly says exit to steps. And let's also make it so that we can't click on this exit to steps hotspot from this screen. And we can do that quite easily just by going to the hotspot itself and setting the limit to camera field as waterfront cam. So we're now able to have the player move from the waterfront to the steps. And what we're going to do is complete the scene and have it so that the player can move all around. Now, last time what we did is we had a hotspot to move us to this marker, and then we used a trigger to actually cut the camera. And that's a more sort of best practice way because this allows us to cut the camera no matter what our movement method is. So if, for example, I run the scene, I go into my settings manager, I can change my movement method to direct, and using the cursor keys without clicking on the hotspot, I'm still able to move over to the steps and the trigger is going to activate. So by having both a hotspot and a trigger, it just means that we can always ensure that the camera will change no matter how we actually entered that region. But to keep things simple, and because this is only going to be a point and click adventure game, what I'm going to do is first of all set this back to point and click, and then I'll remove this trigger now that we've demonstrated it, and I'll make it so that the hotspot itself cuts the camera. So selecting the waterfront to steps hotspot, we already have this use interaction, and I'm going to complete it by now defining an interaction action list. So I'll click on create, and you can see it's made this steps exit to. And if I select that field, you'll see it then appears up in my hierarchy. And we have a node icon next to it. So let's click on it, and that'll bring up the action list editor window for it. So just like the trigger we had, it starts with a default engine wait action. And what we're going to do is we're going to change it to a camera switch action, in which the new camera again is steps. So let's test that out and see how we're doing. Running the scene, I can now click on exit to steps, and he moves over and the camera changes. But there was a little bit of a glitch in that the menu button that appears down here did flicker off and on while that happened. And the reason that that happened is because if I select the steps exit to interaction and have a look at its inspector, you can see that its when running field is set to pause gameplay. So even though this action runs instantaneously, it still momentarily pauses gameplay. It places the game in a cutscene mode. So I'm going to change this to run in background, and that'll just mean that the whole thing is seamless. It doesn't come out of gameplay. If I click on exit to steps, that little UI element in the bottom corner doesn't flicker. So let's now do the return journey so that when we're by the steps, we can go back to the waterfront. Now if I click on gizmos in my game window, you can see that the hotspot that we already have is already pretty much the right shape that we need it to be for steps. Maybe I'll just stretch it out a little bit more so that it covers the whole screen. And we're going to be using a different hotspot, but we're going to have it occupy this same space. So I'll just right click and choose duplicate and rename this new hotspot steps to waterfront. And in its hotspot inspector, I'll change the label to waterfront. The limit to camera I'll assign as steps cam. I'll unset this walk to marker and then create a new one. And then selecting that, I'll move it to around here, just in front of the hotspot and near the default player start. Now we've duplicated the hotspot, but not the interaction. So this use interaction is still set to steps exit to. So I'll select it, clear it with the delete key, choose create to make a new one. And this time it's going to be another camera switch in which we switch to waterfront cam. And again, going to its properties, I'll change the when running to run in background. You can also access the properties of an action list from the bottom of the action list editor. Let's just test this to see how we're doing. Disable gizmos, and I can click down here to go to the steps. And I can do the same for the return journey. I can now use the same principles to create the hotspots for the other areas. Next, I'll be doing from the steps up to the plaza. So with my steps cam in the game window, I'm going to go to my scene manager, create a new hotspot. This time I'll call it steps to plaza. And putting gizmos back on, I'll position and stretch out this new hotspot so that it covers the top of the steps. I'll go to its inspector. The label is going to be plaza because we want it to say exit to plaza. I'm going to limit the camera to the steps. I'll create a new walk to marker. That by default will be placed in the center of the hotspot. I'll just put it down in front of it like this. Going back to the hotspot, I'll create a new use interaction. The cursor icon is going to be exit to. I'll make a new interaction, and before I go and edit that interaction, I'll set the player action to walk to marker. And a quick shortcut to edit this interaction is just to click on the node icon to the right of it. So I can click on that. Again, this will be camera switch, cutting to plaza, and I'll set it to run in background. Let's do the return journey. So I'll select my Plaza cam, choose set as active, and you can see that this too is in the right space. In fact, I might just make it a little bit taller. And then I'll duplicate this, renaming it to Plaza to Steps. Create a new marker. Position it. Limit it to the Plaza cam. Change the label to Steps. Unset the interaction and create a new one. Using a camera switch to cut back to Steps, running in the background. And let's just test this next one, because there is a little bit of a detail here. So disabling gizmos once again. We can go up to the Plaza and back again. But one thing to have a look at here is that aside from the floor, which we'll be changing soon, you can see that we can also access this exit to steps hotspot while we're hovering over this corner of the wall here. And we could just reduce the scale of the hotspot so that it doesn't overlap. If I can enable gizmos, it's a bit more clear. But what we can also do is place down a collider to basically block the mouse's ability to hover over that hotspot. So what I'm going to do is create a new 3D object and then choose cube. And I'm looking at the game window here as I'm positioning it. I'm going to make it so that it lines up with the corner here. The corner of the wall, that is, not the corner of the nav mesh. So this is going to block the mouse being able to hover over that hotspot, and that's because it's also on the default layer, which is what hotspots are also placed on. I don't want to be able to see this, so I'll disable the mesh renderer component, and I also want to make sure it doesn't interfere with any physics or anything like that, so I'll check is trigger. Then running the scene again, I'll exit to the steps, come up here to the Plaza, and you can see when we hover over this portion of the screen, we can exit to the steps, but when I hover over this wall here, we can't. As a bit of housekeeping, I'll rename this cube to, say, corner hotspot blocker, and just move it to my set geometry folder, maybe collapsing some of these as our hierarchy gets a bit bigger. Let's now move on to the last couple of camera transitions, and that's to switch between the Plaza and the office behind this view. I'll make a new hotspot in my scene manager, clicking on hotspot, and I'll name this Plaza to office. And with gizmos enabled in my game window, this might not be too physically accurate, but I'll just do what looks nice according to the game window. Maybe something like this, so that it's right in the lower corner of the screen. Go into its inspector. I'll change the label to office. I'll walk to marker. I'll create. And just so that I can see where this marker exactly will take us to, I'm going to go to my office cam and then choose set as active. And I can see it's coming a little bit too close to this pillar here, so I'll just move it a little bit over here. Going back to this Plaza to office hotspot, I'll limit this to the Plaza cam, create a new user interaction, exit to, player action will be walk to marker, create a new interaction, edit it, and this will be a camera switch, setting the new camera to office cam, and the when running will be run in background. I'll duplicate this hotspot for the return journey. I'll rename it office to plaza, and I'll actually lower it a little bit. It looks a bit better, sort of put lower down in the corner from this view. I'll rename this label to plaza, create a new walk to marker, unset the interaction to make a new one, having it switch back to plaza cam in the background. Oh, and I also do need to change the limit to camera to office cam. So let's test this out, this full journey. I'll disable gizmos and run the scene. And you can see I can exit to the steps here, come up to the plaza. I can either go back or round the corner. Go all the way to the office, back to the plaza, down the steps, and finally back to the waterfront. Up until now, we've been working with this grid-based floor material that we can actually see while we're running the game, and it's quite a bit distracting because it's basically overlaying on top of these photographs. And what we can do is assign a new material to this floor here, and I've already got a material. If I go to my set geometry folder first of all and find this wharf, I'll go to the mesh renderer, and where it says grid, and select the grid material and then change it to matte shadow. And you can see now we now get a nice shadow, but nothing else. So it's a lot nicer to look at. I didn't write this shader. This is coming from the Unity forums, and there's a link to it in the licensed text file in the root tutorial files folder. Now, what we could do is change this material in our edit mode, and then it's always made for us. But it does make it a little bit more difficult to work with, because obviously if I deselect it, you now can't see the floor in our scene. So what I'm going to do instead is have this change made automatically when we begin the game. So I'll change back to the grid material, and then I'll create an on-start cutscene, which is going to be a cutscene that will run when this scene begins. I can make one in my AC game editor, and underneath Scene Cutscenes in the Scene Manager, we've got a list of cutscenes that we can make, and we have this on-start field that is currently empty, so next to it we have a create field. I'll click on it, and so we now have assigned this on-start cutscene. And if I click on the node icon for that, you can see we're presented yet again with the default action, and what I'm going to do this time is change it to an object change material action, and the mesh renderer we're going to be affecting is going to be wharf from our set geometry folder, and the new material is going to be matte shadow. And so this will kick in when we play the scene, so that this all looks a bit nicer, but when we come out of play mode, we can still see our floor. Let's continue our little visual polishes by moving on to scene masks. And I can demonstrate the need for this if I go up to, say, the plaza here, and if we have the player walk behind this corner, you can see they're still visible behind that section of the wall. And that's because the background is just a single static photograph with no depth to it. There are a couple of other instances of this, namely this pillar here in the office background, and also the top of the steps when you get over this lip coming up from the steps camera. If I go into the masks folder inside tutorial files, Wharf, Set, and then masks, you can see we've got a few sprites that are basically these elements cut out for us. The sprites are still the same size, but we've just cropped out everything except the portion of the screen that we want to overlay on top of the player. So for example, with the corner here, we have this corner mask sprite, and what we're going to do is place it in 3D space so that it appears on top of the player when they're behind it. If I go back to my scene manager, under my list of scene prefabs, inside the camera section, we've got this scene sprite type. So if I click on it and create a new one, I'll name this one corner mask. And then going to its inspector, we'll have a look at its components. We've got a sprite renderer, an align to camera component, and a limit visibility component. Let's fill in these fields as we go. So our sprite is going to be corner mask. The align to camera field, and the camera to align to is going to be the one we're viewing here, which is Plaza Cam. And we'll also limit the visibility to that same camera, Plaza Cam. If we have a look at it in the scene window, and you can see it's now facing Plaza Cam. It's a bit far away, but we'll change that later. First, I'm going to click on Center to Camera, and what that does is it places the center of the sprite, and again, this whole sprite is the same size as the background. It's going to center the sprite in the center of the camera view, and then we can increase the size so that it fits the game window properly. So about this kind of size looks right to me. And then what we're going to do is we're going to move it closer to the camera so that it sits within this corner here. Now we move it closer to the camera, but we don't want it to appear any bigger in the game window. So I'm going to check Lock Perceived Scale and then reduce the distance from camera field. And you can see it's not appearing any larger in our game window, but we are now positioned correctly in 3D space. And if we run the game, we can test this out. I can come up the steps and trying to move behind this corner here, you can see the player is now correctly behind it. But if we move down here, he's then displayed above. While the Plaza Cam is still active, let's do the same with the Steps Mask 2 sprite, which is a little bit harder to see, but it's basically covering this area of the top of the steps here. I'll do the same thing. I'll make a new scene sprite, this one called Steps Mask. And I'll assign the sprite as Steps Mask 2. Camera to align to is going to be Plaza Cam. As well as the camera, we're going to limit visibility to. It's a bit far away. It's all the way down by the waterfront now. I'll click on Center to Camera and then raise the scale to about so. Check Lock Perceived Scale and reduce the distance so that it appears just at the top of the lip of the stairs. There is a Steps Mask 2 that you may or may not need depending on the placement of your hotspots, but I think I've actually managed to do away with the need for that. So I'll move on to Pillar Mask, which is going to be viewed in the Office Cam. So I'll select Office Cam and click Set as Active. Add a new scene sprite. I'll name this Pillar Mask and assign Pillar Mask, the sprite, into my sprite field and Office Cam as both the camera to limit visibility to and the camera to align to. Now it's actually placed it in the center of the scene, which is actually behind the camera. So I'll quickly disable the align to camera component move it in front of the camera, and then re-enable that component. Center to the camera, increase the scale, lock the perceived scale, and I want it to be positioned in the same space that we cut out from the nav mesh. So if I just open up the navigation window and keep it docked down here, just so that we can see the nav mesh at the same time, I'm going to reduce the distance from the camera so that the pillar mask is inside that little hole there. Now, depending on your exact positioning, you may find that the corner mask that we place down actually gets in the way of your camera here. Let me see if I can demonstrate. Yeah, if it's just a little bit closer, then it's going to be appearing in front of your camera. But what you can do to combat that is actually just uncheck the sprite renderer. In fact, I'll do that for all three masks. I'll just disable their renderers, and that is because they already have the limit visibility component, which means they will be enabled automatically when they're supposed to be. So I can actually see in the scene window when we come up to the plaza, this corner mask is enabled and it becomes disabled again once we leave to the office. Up to this point, we've been making use of Tin Pot, who's the 3D demo game's player character, but now it's time to make our own player character that suits the Soon a little bit better. We can find a model for our player inside Tutorial Files, Wharf, and then Characters, and then Girl. And you can see we have this girl model file that I'll just drag into the scene. If I zoom in on her, you can see she doesn't have a material assigned, but I can go into the Materials folder and just drag the girl material onto her. Let's get rid of Tin Pot now, and we'll convert this model into a player character. If I go up to Adventure Creator, Editors, and then Character Wizard, we'll then be presented with this pop-up window that allows us to quickly configure a model or a sprite in our scene into a character. Just like the New Game Wizard, this is a case of choosing Next and going through each field that we're given. We'll choose that this is going to be a player and then assign the default graphic. So this is going to be the girl's model file. Choosing Next. How is our player going to be animated? And we're going to be relying on Mechanim, or Unity's animator system. And I'll finish that. And you can see that this model has been updated with an audio source component and a player and a paths component, as well as some rigid body and collider components. Some of these need a little bit of tweaking. It's really just laying down the components. They may not be final. So I'll click on the edit field for the collider and raise it up. Maybe make it a little bit thinner, like so. We have some animations for this character inside the animations folder, and all of these are taken from Unity's standard assets package. So for example, humanoid walk, if we have a look at that and play that, this is a root motion animation, which means the animation is not just playing on the spot, it's physically moving the character. So we're going to want to make sure that apply root motion is checked in the animator component. Let's create a new animator controller. So inside my 2.5D game folder, I'll right click and choose create new animator controller, and I'll name this human because I'm going to apply it to some other character later on. Going back to the girl, I'll assign human as the controller, and if I double click on it, I'll open up the animator window. This is going to be a fairly simple controller. We're just going to have 3 animations for now. We're going to have idle, walk, and a run, but we'll make use of a blend tree so that the 3 of those can blend more nicely together. I'll right click in the window and choose Create State from New Blend Tree. and I'll name this blend tree Locomotion. Double click to open. I'll select this blend tree and I'll add 3 new motion fields. Now this is all using Unity's animator system, so if you're not familiar with this, do go and check the Unity documentation. I'll set the first motion field to humanoid idle, which I can get by expanding this model file here. The second as humanoid walk, and the third as humanoid run. If I play this, I can then move this little red gizmo here to test it out. But to drive it at runtime, we're going to need use of a float parameter. So I'll go to the Animator's Parameters tab, and you can see it's automatically created a parameter for me, but I'll rename this to Move Speed. And the thresholds are automated, so when move speed is equal to about 0.5, she's going to be playing humanoid walk, and when it's all the way up to 1, she'll be playing humanoid run. Going back to the player component, we'll go through our mechanism parameters, and these are basically parameters that we will allow AC to control. And so this move speed float is going to be a parameter that AC will update as she walks around the scene. By default, it's just named speed, but to match the parameter in our animator component, I'll rename it Move Speed. We don't have a talking animation, so I'll remove is talking, and the same for jump. Underneath movement settings, we have fields for our walk and run speed scales. And so these are going to be the values of our move speed when walking and running. Now, because we're using root motion as set in the animating component, the actual motion speed of the character is going to be driven through animation. So all we want to do is set the walk speed scale to 0.5 and the run speed scale to 1, which matches up to the threshold values in the blend tree. Running the scene now, you can find that we are now controlling this girl instead of the robot. And if I single click, she'll walk. If I double click, she'll run. There is a little bit of a teething problem though. If I say double click to go up to the plaza, she does a little hop as she comes up the steps there. And that's because we're using root motion, so we're using motion to control the physics and not the rigid body. Now we could do things like try to configure the animation's Y value settings or increase the mass and so on, but a quick and easy way is to simply remove the rigid body and the capsule collider, and instead go to Add Component and add a character controller. And this will mean that she still is subject to gravity, but she's not going to have jerky motion so much. I'll set the height to about 2.8 and the Y value of the center to 1.4. And let's just test again. And if I double click, yeah, she's got a bit smoother motion now. Finally, we'll make her the default player, which we can assign in the settings manager. We have this player field, but this player field accepts only a prefab. So I'll drag the whole object into the My 2.5D game folder. I'll opt to create an original prefab, and then I'll drag this prefab into the player field. And we can demonstrate the use of this by now removing the girl from the scene. And when I play the game, she's automatically spawned in at runtime. Let's move on to audio. I'm going to be having my game on mute while I do this because I don't want it to interfere with my voice. But if you have this unchecked, then you should be able to hear the sounds as we make them. The audio we're going to use is in Tutorial Files, Wharf, and then Audio. And you can see we have a number of footstep sounds and a couple of ambient sounds. We're going to start with adding some footstep sounds to the player. There's a number of ways we can add sounds to a character's footsteps, and I'm going to start with the most simple way. Inside the My 2.5D game folder, I'm going to edit the girl player prefab. In 2018.3 you can do this just by double clicking, otherwise you'll have to drag her into the scene and apply changes afterwards. So I have my girl prefab viewed, and I'll go to the root game object, and underneath my player you can see that we have an audio clip field for the walk sound, as well as a run sound, and also a sound child. Now the sound child was created automatically using the character wizard, but if you don't have one, it's basically just a child object of the root that has both an audio source and a sound component. So the most simple way to assign a footstep sound to the player is to simply drag the sound clip into the walk sound component, and that'll just cause the player to play this sound whenever they're walking. But there isn't going to be any variety to the sound, it's just going to be the same sound looping over and over again, and it's not going to synchronize with the animation. So I'll undo this change and come out of prefab edit mode. And one thing I do want to highlight at this point is that if I go back to my settings manager, the player field has become unset. And so far as I can tell, this is actually an issue with Unity itself. So I'm just going to have to re-drag the girl prefab back into this player field. Now a slightly more involved way to add footstep sounds is to make use of the dedicated footstep sounds component. And I'm going to add the footstep sounds component to the root object. So I'm editing the prefab again. I'll scroll down to the bottom, choose add component, and add footstep sounds. And you should be placing this on the same component as the animator, for reasons we'll see in a moment. But looking at its inspector, you'll see we have a number of footstep sounds field, and this is for walking sounds. We have 7 footstep sounds, so I'll enter this value as 7. And then we get fields for each sound. So we then just need to drag each audio clip into the inspector. And you can see from the message below that sounds will be chosen at random. So the more sounds you add, the more natural and a little bit more variety you'll get as you walk around. We don't have any running sounds, so I'll just leave this as 0. But we then need to assign both the character and the sound to play from. The character is going to be this girl, so I'll assign the same game object into the field, and the sound to play from I'll set to the sound child. And again, this sound child is just an audio source and sound component as a child object of my root. Now we have this play sounds field that at the moment is set to via animation events. Now we could set this to automatically, and that would just cause the footstep sounds to play whenever the character is walking. You can set the separation time between these sounds, but it wouldn't really sync up correctly with the footsteps themselves so far as the animation goes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose via animation events and then modify the animation to fire off those events. You can see another message down here. It says a sound will be played whenever this component's play footstep function is run. So let's go to the animation folder, and I'll select humanoid walk, and going to the animation tab, we only have this humanoid walk animation to choose from. I'll scroll down to events, pause it, and then scrub through the timeline to get the right position. I'm going to choose about here, frame 224, which is where the left foot just touches the ground. I'll click on this little add event button, and I'll set the function name to play footstep. I'll scrub through to find the right foot, around about here. I'll add a new animation event, play Footstep again, and neither of these functions take parameters, so I'll just leave the rest blank and click on Apply. I'll come out of prefab edit mode, and again, because we've made changes to our player prefab, I'm going to have to reassign the girl prefab. So if you now play the game, if you were listening to this without mute on, you'll be hearing audio clips as she walks around the scene. The other two sounds we have in our audio folder are office and water. And these are both ambient sounds, so we'll have them playing in the scene, and we'll position them in 3D space so that they change volume according to where we are. In my scene manager, I'll go down to Logic and click on Sound. Actually, I'll make two of them, and I'll name the first of them Office and the second one Water. Go into their inspectors. I'll expand the audio source component, and I'll set the spatial blend to 3D so that these are fully 3D sounds. I'll make them affect a slightly wider distance, and with the water, this is going to come from the canal that you see in the waterfront, so I'll place it kind of around here. And with the office, this is going to be further up the steps, so I'll move it over to around here. So the office is going to have the office audio clip, and with the water object, we'll assign the water clip. I'll select both of these, and I'll check play on awake and loop for both. And I'll just tweak the relative volumes between them, because if we have a look at, say, water, we have quite a quiet volume, whereas for office, the amplitude is much bigger. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the office sound object and just reduce the relative volume so that the two sounds have similar amplitudes. In this sound component, you can see we have a sound type, and these are both already set to SFX, which is what we want, and these relate to the volume levels of our game. So if I just run the game and I press escape or click on this menu button, because we're using the default menu interface, we get this options menu, and here we can change the volume levels of speech, music, and sound effects. So by using this sound component, we're able to automatically connect the volume levels. Now if we wanted to add some effects or anything like that to some of our sounds, we'd want to make use of Unity's audio mixer system. So while the sounds will play at the moment, we might want to do some effects to them in the future. So what I'm going to do is have these sounds playing via audio mixer groups. If I go to the game editor and then the settings manager, scrolling down to audio settings, we have this volume controlled by field set to audio sources. If I change this to audio mixer groups, we now have quite a few new fields appear, and we basically need mixers and attenuation parameters for each of the three sound types. I'll go back to the My 2.5D game folder, right click and choose Create Audio Mixer. I'll name this Master because all of our groups are going to be children of this. Double clicking brings up the audio mixer window, and then I'll create 3 new groups by clicking the plus icon next to groups. I'll rename the first music, the second speech, and the third one SFX. But I don't want these to be parented to one another, so I'll just make these all shared children of the master. I can then drag these into the audio settings fields, so speech, music, and SFX. And then going on to these attenuation parameters, This is basically how Adventure Creator controls the volume of each. So we have this music volume parameter we need to define. So with my music group selected, I'm going to go to its inspector and right-click on volume and choose expose volume of music to script. I'll do the same for each of these. And I can then rename these in the audio mixer window. So my exposed param, which is volume of music, I'll change to music volume. I'll change the volume of SFX to SFX volume, and the last to speech volume. And if I then play the scene, move the audio mixer up to maybe over here, you can see that we're now playing sound effects via that audio mixer group. Let's do something a little bit different now and go and add a stealth mechanic to our game. Now this is still going to be a traditional point-and-click adventure game. We're only going to be able to make a very rudimentary system, but inside the wharf, characters and then animation folder, you can see we have a humanoid crouch model file. And if we expand that, we've got a number of crouching animations. So let's make use of some of these. I'll double click on my human animator controller to bring up the window. And we still have our locomotion blend tree open. I'll go back to the base layer and I'll create a new blend tree. I'll rename this blend tree crouching. And in fact, I'll go back to our original locomotion blend tree and rename that standing. Double clicking on this new blend tree and selecting the blend tree in the middle here, I'll create another couple of motion fields. The first of these I'll assign humanoid crouch idle and the second humanoid crouch walk. And again, this is all tied to the move speed parameter, but the move speed when walking is going to be about 0.5, which is a little bit slow here. So what I'll do is uncheck automate thresholds and change the threshold for the walking animation to 0.5. Going back to the base layer, I'm going to create a Boolean parameter that determines which of these two blend trees are playing. So I'll click on the plus icon, create a new bool, name this in stealth mode, and then right click, choose make transition from standing to crouching, and do the same thing for crouching to standing. I'll select each of these in turn and change the condition to in stealth mode, and for standing to transition to crouching, we're going to have in stealth mode be true. I'll uncheck exit time, and for the crouching to standing transition, again I'll uncheck has exit time, and I'll create a new condition in which in stealth mode is now false. And we can test this out so far by just running the game. I'll select the girl again to bring up the animator window that's live, and I can just click on the in stealth mode checkbox, and you can see she's now crouching around. If I uncheck, she'll go back to walking. So let's add a means of toggling the stealth mode by pressing a button on the keyboard. We can have Adventure Creator respond to key presses by creating active inputs. If I go up to the top toolbar and choose Adventure Creator, Editors, Active Inputs Editor, we'll then get the Active Inputs window. I'll click on Create New Active Input, and I'll give this the name Stealth. The input button will be Stealth Mode, and we'll have to define this. And this button doesn't exist yet, so let's make it now. I can go up to Edit, Project Settings, I'll dock the project settings window over here and then select on input. If you're using Unity 2018.2 or earlier, you can do the same thing by going to edit project settings and then input. I'll expand the axes and create a new axis by increasing the size by 1. And I'll name this new input Stealth Mode, which matches up with the input button in our active input list. I'll set the button to Tab and then close. We have some more properties for our active input. This is going to be a button. It's enabled by default and it will be available when the game is normal. And this refers to normal gameplay, so it's not going to work during a cutscene. We can define an action list when this is triggered by clicking on Create, and you can see we have active input Stealth assigned in the field. That's placed here in my project window. I'll just drag it into the My 2.5D game folder. And if I double click on it, we can get the action list editor for this action list. So this is going to run whenever we press the Tab key. Now we can use the character animate action with isPlayerChecked to change the values of our parameters. So we can use this to change the in stealth mode parameter. But we need a way of determining what mode we're in. So we're going to do that with a variable. And if I go to the AC Game Editor and click on the Variables tab, you can see we have a section for global and for local. I'll click on Create New Global Variable, and I'll name this is in stealth mode. The type is going to match the parameter in the animator. It's going to be a Boolean, and it's going to be false or unchecked by default. Going back to the action list editor, let's change this action to a variable check action. And you can see, because we only have one variable defined, this is already set up for us. So it's going to be comparing is in stealth mode to the entered value. We're going to be checking if it's true. So if it is, we're first of all going to set it to false. So from this output socket, and I'm choosing the top of these two, because if it's true, the condition will be met. And then what we're going to do is set it to false. And we can set it to false by changing the action type to variable set. And you can see it's already done for us. Is in stealth mode is going to be set to false. On the other hand, if this variable check checks that the variable is set to false, we're going to want to set it to true. So I'm going to make another variable set action, this time coming out of the is condition is not met socket. And this time I'm going to set the statement to true. And after both of these, we'll then run a character animate action to update the animator's parameter. So starting with this chain here on the left, I'm going to make a new action, choose character animate. We'll be animating the player and changing the parameter value of, let's just make sure we get the name right, in stealth mode. So I'll type in stealth mode as the name of my parameter to effect. The parameter type is a bool, and the setter's value will check. So it'll set the value to true. We're going to do the opposite here. So I'll just, in fact, copy this, right click and choose paste copied action. This time I'll uncheck setter's value and connect that with the previous variable set. We can now run the game, and if I press the tab key, she toggles between crouching and standing. Again, you can see that the menu button is flickering on and off, so I'll just go back to this action list's properties and set the when running field to run in background. A stealth mechanic isn't really complete until we actually have someone to hide from. So we're going to be hiding from an NPC. We've got some graphics for him in tutorial files, Wharf characters, and then Guy. I'll drop him into the scene. And he also has his own material that I can get from his materials folder and then just drag onto his model. Going to his inspector and finding his animator, we're going to recycle the human animator controller we made. So I'll click on controller and select human, and that'll mean that he has access to the standing and crouching animation blend trees we already made, as well as the parameters we defined. Again, we can use the character wizard to convert him into an NPC. So I'm going to go up to the top toolbar and choose Editors, Character Wizard. Choose Next. Our base graphic, is this going to be a player or an NPC? This is going to be an NPC. The character's name is going to be, let's say, Steve. And we then just assign this model file from the hierarchy into the field. It's guessing here that we're using Mechanim, which is correct. So I'll choose Next again and Finish. And he's now been turned into an NPC. Again, we need to tweak some of these components a little bit. Now he's got a capsule collider that's a little bit wrong. I could replace this with a character controller as we did the player, but actually he's not going to be moving around, so I'm not going to be too worried about that. Where we're going to put him is up along the plaza. So I'm going to open the cameras, game cameras folder, select Plaza Cam, and then click on Set as Active. And I want to place him around here so that he's not going to spot the player so long as they're crouching because of this wall in between them. So I'll move him up to around here, a little bit lower down, and then turn him so that he's facing the steps. You can see that he's off the nav mesh here. We don't need him to be on the nav mesh, but because he has a rigid body, I don't want him to fall down due to gravity. So I'm just going to make a new plane by going to Create 3D Object, Plane. And I'll just move it so that it's underneath him. Maybe shrink it down a bit. And this will also mean that he gets a little bit of a shadow as well. So maybe that looks about right. And then I'll set the mesh renderer of this plane. I'll set the material to matte shadow, which is what we're also changing the wharf floor here to. I'll move his object into the NPCs folder. And looking through his inspector, we can see down at the bottom here, he has a hotspot component, which combined with his collider makes him interactive. Now we're not going to add very much interactivity, we'll just have it so that the player says something if we click on him. So I'll create a new use interaction. The cursor icon I'll set to look at. The player action, maybe just turn to face, and then I'll click on create besides interaction to make a new one. Click on the node icon to edit it, and this will just be a simple dialogue play speech action in which the player, by checking the player line, is able to say, I'd better keep out of his way. Let's test our progress. And if I double click to run up the steps, actually it seems he's in the view of the steps here actually. So let's come back into edit mode, make the steps cam active, and I'll select both him and his plane, move it maybe just a little bit out of view. How does that look from the view of the plaza cam? Yeah, we can still see him. And I'll also just move this plane into the set geometry folder, and I'll just rename it to maybe NPC floor. So again, just running the scene to test it. I'll come up to the top of the steps here, and I can hover over him. It says, look at Steve. And the girl says, I'd better keep out of his way. So let's do just that. So we want the NPC to basically detect if the player is walking past him in his line of sight. And we're going to cheat a little bit. We're not going to actually physically check any kind of line of sight or anything like that. We're just going to make use of a simple trigger. In the AC game editor, I'm going to go back to the scene manager once more and create a new trigger. And I'll name this guard spotter. And I'll place it up at the top of the steps here. In fact, I'll enable gizmos just for a moment inside my game window. Stretch it out so that it covers the whole width of the walkable area. That looks about right. And then go into its inspector. We want this to basically run all the time. So I'm going to have the trigger type set to continuous. And what it's going to be doing is checking the state of our variable. But because it's going to be running all the time, we don't want it to interrupt gameplay. So I'm going to change the when running field to run in background. And let's say the player is around here at the bottom of the plaza, and we click on the hotspot to go down the steps. We want this to interrupt that. So if the player is walking over to the hotspot, we're going to want the trigger to kick in. So to do that, I'll check cancels interactions. We can then start working on the actions themselves. So opening up the action list editor, I'm going to make this a variable check action, in which again we're checking the state of the in stealth mode variable. And if it's true, which is what this condition is already set to, we don't want anything to happen. We only want something to happen if the condition is not met, so if we are not in stealth mode. And in this case, we want gameplay to end. We want to make a non-interactive cutscene. But this trigger itself is running in the background, so we're going to run a new action list. And we can do that by changing the if condition is not met field to run cutscene. It'll then give us a cutscene to run field. I'll click create to make a new one. And I'll rename this cutscene guard sees player. And you can see that this cutscene is set to pause gameplay. So editing guard sees player, I'm going to first of all stop the player from moving, and that'll be with a character move along path action, in which the player has a move method of stop moving, and will then have a character face object action in which we'll get the player to face the NPC. So I'll check affect player, facing with her body, and the object to face will be the guy NPC. I'll check wait until finish, and then we'll have another dialogue play speech action, and this time it's going to be the guard speaking, so the speaker is going to be guard, and his line text will be hold it right there. And because we've sort of failed this little mini game, we're going to place the player back down at the start. So we're going to teleport the player and cut the camera. So next we'll make a object teleport action. We'll be teleporting the player and teleporting her back to the default player start. So default player start, copy the rotation of that player start, and we'll also make another camera switch action in which the new camera is waterfront cam. Let's test this out now. We can exit to the steps. I'll run up to the plaza, and before I do so, I'll just press tab to go into stealth mode. And here we are, able to sneak around. But if I press tab again to come out of it, the guard spots us and we're sent back to the beginning. Let's work on making a few improvements to our interface. Right now we're using the default Adventure Creator interface, which means that we have this menu button down at the lower left, and if I hover over the top portion of the screen, I can access the inventory. Since we're not using any inventory items in this tutorial, I'll remove this and replace it with a button that allows us to toggle our stealth mode without having to press on the keyboard. We can edit our interface by going to the menu manager in the AC game editor, and at the bottom you can see we have a list of all of the menus that make up our interface. And if I select, for example, inventory, you can see it previewed in the game window. Further down, we now have our properties for the inventory menu, and you can see that its source is set to Adventure Creator. Alternatively, we can render this with Unity UI, in which case we'll be relying on a UI canvas instead of this built-in rendering system. I can prevent this inventory from showing by checking Start Game Locked Off, and now I'll create a new menu to house the Toggle Stealth button. So I can click on Create New Menu. I'll give it the name Stealth Mode. I'll leave its source as Adventure Creator only for the moment. Going down, I'll set its appear type to during gameplay, and this will prevent it from showing whenever we're in a cutscene or the game is paused. And you can see, because we're previewing an Adventure Creator menu, we've got this little yellow preview box here in the middle. Currently it's just an empty box because we don't have anything to display. So from the list of elements, I'm going to choose Button and then Add New. And you can see this has now been updated to show our new button. Just like the menu, we have a number of properties for this element. I'm going to set the button text to Toggle Stealth Mode. And its click type is set to Run Action List. And what we're going to do is have it run the same action list that triggers whenever we press the Tab key. And that is active input _ stealth. I'm not worried too much about the design right now, but let's just quickly test the scene and see what happens. So we now have Toggle Stealth Mode appearing, and if I click on it, then the player will do just that. So let's make this look a little bit fancier, and really this Adventure Creator source option is best used for prototyping and getting an interface up and running quickly. For real fine-tuning over a menu's display, we're going to want to use Unity UI. So first of all, I'm going to set this source option to Unity UI Prefab. You can see the preview then disappears, and we're replaced with linked canvas prefab and rect transform boundary fields here in the menu's properties. So we're going to create a new Unity UI canvas and connect these up. So that I don't interfere with anything else in my scene, I'm going to do this from a new scene. So I'll go to File, New Scene. And then in my hierarchy, I'm going to choose Create UI Button. This has made a new canvas with a button inside. I'll enable 2D viewing mode, and if I double click on the button and come out of it, we can see it's kind of below the camera. So let me just place it up in the upper left corner. Now this isn't going to be a tutorial on working with Unity UI as such, but I will make a few changes to make it fit in with the rest of the interface. Let's go to the button's image component and make it, say, transparent black. I'll go to the text component and make the text color white and change the font to chunk 5. And I'll enter in the text as Toggle Stealth. Finally, I'll rename the canvas to Stealth UI. And because we're going to be spawning this in every scene, we're going to make this a prefab so that Adventure Creator can do this automatically. So I'll pick this up and drag it into my 2.5D game folder. And then going back to the menu manager, I can now assign this Stealth UI prefab into my linked canvas prefab field. We next have a rect transform boundary, which is not really essential in this instance, but it's important to set whenever we want to reposition the menu at runtime. And this is essentially just a rect transform that spans the whole interactive area of the menu. That is actually the button that takes up the same space. And there's a couple of ways I can assign it now that we have Unity 2018.3. I can either assign it from a scene instance, and you can see that this has updated with a recorded constant ID label here. The number here is 6628, but that'll be different for you. But the important thing is that if we go back to the button in our scene, it's been updated with a constant ID component with a value that matches the same thing. And because we're working on a scene instance and not the prefab, I just need to go back up to the root object and make sure that these changes are applied back to the prefab. Let's now assign the button, and scrolling down to the button properties, you can see that this has been changed also to provide a linked button field. And to demonstrate a different way of doing this in Unity 2018.3, which has a new prefab system, I can double click on the Stealth UI prefab and assign the button from prefab mode. Coming out of that, I'll load up my wharf scene, and if we run it, we'll now get our toggle stealth mode button up here, and I can click on this to toggle crouching. Let's finish up this tutorial by acting as though we were making a proper game here and add the ability to translate our game if we wanted to. Before we can translate our game, we need to ensure that all of the game's text is gathered up and recorded. And to do that, we'll first have to include this scene in the build settings. I can do this by going to File, Build Settings, and then clicking Add Open Scenes to add this scene to the build. I have an empty scene here, so I'll just remove that. And we can now gather up the text by going to the Speech Manager, and scrolling down to the bottom, we have a section for languages, and we have our original language here, and we can create a new translation, but we're getting this warning saying no text has been gathered for translations. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. Underneath Game Text, I'll click Gather Text. We'll then be warned that we should probably back up our scene and so on beforehand. I'm just going to assume that everything will be alright. I'll press OK. And once the process has been completed, we'll be told we've had some lines added, and we can use these filter boxes to view them. So right now we're looking at speech, and the scene filter, if I just change it to any or no scene, you can see that we've got the 2 lines of dialogue that we've already written. We've got the text, the scene, and the speaker, as well as information about any audio file that we'd have to create if we wanted speech audio to be present in our game. Going back up to languages, I could now click on Create New Translation. For example, I'll name this French. And if I then go back down to this speech line, you can see we now have a French translation box that we could either edit here or export this all into a CSV file. And we can do that by going up to Language, number 1, French, clicking on this cog icon to the right and choosing Export. That would then create a spreadsheet that we could then re-import back into this speech manager to update all of our French text at once. Another handy feature is that we can prevent the original language from showing at runtime. So here we have the original language, and I'll check Don't Use at Runtime. And if I rename this French translation to, say, English, this will still be a copy of our game's original text, but the actual text that we entered into, for example, our dialogue play speech actions will not be used. So we can just edit all of our game's text here in the speech manager. So we're just about ready to wrap this up. But one thing I want to just touch on is the save system. And because we're using the default interface, that means we can go to the pause menu here and we can use this to save and load our game. So what I'll do is make this scene compatible with the save system. And this basically comes down to flagging up different objects with the kind of data that need to be saved. For example, we want to save which of our cameras is active, and we want to save the state of the player's animator component because we're changing that when we toggle stealth mode. Now, it is important to go through the manual and go through the saving chapter, because there might be a few cases where you need to do it manually, but for the most part we can automate this just by going up to the settings manager, and underneath save game settings I can click on auto add save components to game objects, and again we'll be asked to back up our project and make sure everything is saved. I'll press OK, and it will then go through and flag up all of the objects correctly, or at least it should do. So let's just test this out. And maybe if I just move over here, I'll open up the pause menu and save in slot 1. I'll come up halfway up the steps, toggle stealth mode, and save into slot 2. So if I load back into slot 1, you can see the player and the camera are correctly loading. Well, that about wraps it up for this tutorial. I hope people found it useful, and thank you for watching.